In 2024 coverage, former President Donald Trump was at the Mid-America Center a short time ago, making a campaign stop and delivering a message to the people of Iowa and Nebraska. 6 News' Joe Harris was there and has more on that for us this afternoon. Hey, Joe.
That's right. Making a stop in Council Bluffs, the former president appealed to farmers, saying during his time in the White House, he looked out for them.
To protect family farms, I eliminated the unfair estate tax or death tax so that
Iowa State Representative Mike Sexton praised Donald Trump for being supportive of policies that Iowa farmers benefit from. Trump used the occasion to take shots at GOP rival Ron DeSantis and President Joe Biden, saying both men are bad for heartland farmers.
With the insane Green New Deal, Joe Biden is trying to totally kill Iowa ethanol and replace it with expensive electric cars. This is what the people...
Now, Trump also told the crowd DeSantis wants to outsource every American farming job to a foreign country. Jacqueline, Lauren?
Joe, thank you. And of course, we'll have more coverage on former President Trump's campaign stop in Council Bluffs later on tonight.